The sea had always carried whispers. Waves rolling against the Levantine coast seemed to murmur stories, stories of ships that once danced upon their surface, stories of merchants who shouted in a dozen tongues, and stories of harbors that thrummed like living hearts. Along this narrow strip of land, between the rising Lebanon mountains and the restless Mediterranean, the Phoenicians carved out a destiny that the world would both remember and forget. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, names that once commanded awe across the ancient seas. Today their remnants lie buried under stone and soil, or swallowed by silt where old harbors sank. But there was a time when these cities blazed like stars along the coastline, their lights guiding sailors, their markets overflowing with goods, and their voices carried across empires. To imagine them is to step back into a world where the sea was the true road to power. The Phoenicians were never a single kingdom, nor a vast empire with armies stretching across continents. They were a network of cities, each independent, each proud, but bound by the salt and spray of the Mediterranean. Where other civilizations built their might on armies and conquest, the Phoenicians built theirs on cedar ships and daring voyages. In their sails lay ambition, in their harbors opportunity. Byblos, the oldest of these harbors, stretched deep into antiquity. Archaeologists unearthed evidence of its trade with Egypt as far back as 3000 BCE. Cedar trees, tall and straight, were felled in the mountain forests and shipped downriver to waiting docks, bound for the Nile where pharaohs raised them into ships and temples. From Egypt came papyrus, rolls of writing material that would later give Byblos its very name. The Greeks, centuries later, called the city Byblos, and from that word came Biblion, the book. Even in language, the Phoenicians left a legacy hidden in plain sight. Sidon, not far to the south, emerged as a rival harbor. Its craftsmen learned the secrets of glass-making, shaping sand into vessels that caught the light like frozen water. But its greatest treasure came from the sea itself, the murex shellfish. From its tiny body came drops of dye, purple so deep it glowed with an otherworldly fire. The process was slow, messy, and costly, but the result was a color that became the mark of royalty. Kings, emperors, and priests paid fortunes for garments dipped in Sidon's purple. It was not just a color, but a statement of power, of exclusivity, of divine right. Further still lay Tyre, half on the mainland, half upon an island fortress. Its double harbor made it unassailable, its walls rose defiant against the sea, and its merchants stretched their hands farther than any of their neighbors. Tyre would one day defy great conquerors, endure long sieges, and send its children across the sea to found colonies as far away as Spain. In its stone walls and salty air, one can still sense the heartbeat of a city that once believed it could not fall. But who were the Phoenicians truly? Historians often call them the Canaanites of the coast, descendants of the same people who lived across the Levant. They spoke a Semitic tongue, kin to Hebrew and Aramaic. Yet while their cousins looked inland, the Phoenicians turned seaward. They were not warriors but navigators, not conquerors but connectors. Their cities thrived not on land but on the water, as if the sea itself had chosen them as its companions. For centuries these harbors linked civilizations. Egyptian gold and papyrus, Mesopotamian textiles, Anatolian metals, all passed through Phoenician docks. Their ships sailed not as invaders, but as messengers, carrying culture, goods, and knowledge. Every plank of cedar that creaked in the wind carried with it a fragment of the ancient world's heartbeat. And yet, despite their brilliance, the Phoenicians left behind little of their own voice. Unlike the Egyptians with their hieroglyphs, or the Mesopotamians with their clay tablets, the Phoenicians wrote little that survives. What we know of them comes largely from others, Greeks, Romans, and Hebrews who observed them, traded with them, sometimes fought them. The people who invented the alphabet left few records of themselves. Their story, paradoxically, must be pieced together from the writings of others. Perhaps that is why their harbors feel haunted today. To walk the ruins of Byblos, or to stand upon the stony shore where Sidon once thrived, is to sense a presence just out of reach, like a voice speaking from beneath the waves. Their cities are gone, but the sea remembers. Each wave that crashes against the rocks carries with it a memory of sails unfurled, of anchors dropped, of oars cutting through water. The Phoenicians existed in the space between power and obscurity. They never marched as conquerors, never raised great monuments like the pyramids, never carved their names into stone for eternity. Instead, they carved the sea itself. And in that choice lies both their brilliance and their tragedy, to build an empire not of land but of water, always shifting, always fragile. It is here in these ancient harbors that their story begins. With cedar forests stretching above them and endless waters stretching before them, the Phoenicians faced a choice: to remain bound to a narrow strip of land or to trust the horizon. They chose the horizon, and in doing so became masters of seas that no empire could fully command. Yet this beginning carries a mystery. How could a people who gave the world ships, trade, and even the alphabet fade so quietly into history's shadows? Why did the harbors that once roared with life fall silent? And why do their voices come to us only as echoes, filtered through the words of others? The sea does not answer, it only whispers. And as the waves roll across the Levantine shore, they carry us forward, into the mountains and the waters that shaped these forgotten mariners. The harbors are silent now, but the land still remembers. Between mountains and the sea, the Phoenicians' true destiny was waiting. The story of the Phoenicians could not have been written anywhere else in the world. Here, the earth itself seemed to dictate destiny. The strip of coast was so narrow that in many places one could look eastward and see the mountain peaks, then turn westward and glimpse the shimmering horizon of the sea. There was little room for grand kingdoms inland, no broad plains like those of Egypt, no fertile valleys like those of Mesopotamia. Yet in this confinement, the Phoenicians discovered boundless possibility. The land offered paradoxes. Its soil was thin and stingy, unable to sustain the large farming populations that nourished empires elsewhere. Grains could be grown, yes, but never in quantities sufficient to feed many. This limitation pushed the Phoenicians to depend on others for sustenance and in turn to trade. What their own earth withheld, the sea seemed eager to provide. The Mediterranean lapped at their shores with infinite patience, carrying ships, fish, and currents that linked distant peoples. Most civilizations of the ancient world saw the sea as a boundary, a dangerous border to be respected but not embraced. To the Phoenicians it was the opposite, a wide road shimmering and endless, a highway of opportunity. Where others saw peril, they saw possibility. One gift of the land proved decisive: the cedar forests. Cloaking the Lebanon mountains were towering cedars, trees so tall and straight that they seemed to pierce the heavens. Their fragrance lingered in the air, and their wood was prized for strength and durability. Egypt, with its deserts and palms, lacked such timber. Mesopotamia, with its broad rivers, longed for ships, but lacked the forests to build them. The Phoenicians, standing between both, possessed what others craved: cedar strong enough for temples, palaces, and above all for ships. The cedar forests became the lifeblood of Phoenician identity. Ancient hymns from Mesopotamia praised the cedars of Lebanon, and Egyptian pharaohs recorded their expeditions north to acquire this sacred wood. In Egyptian temples, cedar beams supported monumental roofs. In Mesopotamian myths, gods and heroes clashed over the cedar forests as though they were divine treasure. For the Phoenicians, these trees became both shield and sword, the material through which they could navigate the seas and build their fortune. But even cedar had its limits. A forest could not feed a population, nor could it alone defend a coastline vulnerable to invasion. The geography that offered timber and access to the sea also left the Phoenicians exposed. Armies from inland empires could march down the valleys that pierced the mountains. Egyptians from the south, Hittites from Anatolia, and later Assyrians and Babylonians all found their way to this narrow coastal plain. The Phoenicians learned early that survival did not come from armies and walls alone, but from negotiation, tribute, and above all, adaptability. This geography shaped not just their politics, but their character. A people who could not rely on the generosity of their soil had to rely on the resourcefulness of their minds and the courage of their hearts. To survive, they built ships. To thrive, they they sailed them into the unknown. The coastline itself offered natural gifts for this ambition. It was jagged and irregular, with inlets, coves, and natural harbors. Unlike Egypt's long unbroken shore, which provided few safe anchorages, the Phoenician coast was carved into the perfect stepping stones of maritime life. Sidon, Tyre, Byblos, Arwad, each city nestled into a natural harbor, each becoming a gateway between land and sea. Their very survival depended on movement, on exchange, on finding opportunity wherever others had overlooked it. To stand in Byblos or Tyre in those ancient days was to hear a symphony of languages drifting through the streets. Egyptian merchants bartered for timber. Traders from Mesopotamia arrived seeking cedar and glass. Local artisans sold dyed fabrics, jars of olive oil, and carved ivory brought from Africa. Goods flowed in and out like the tides themselves. The mountains gave them their materials, but the sea gave them their reach. And yet, the Phoenicians were not entirely free. The narrowness of their land ensured dependence on larger neighbors. Egypt coveted their cedar and demanded tribute. Mesopotamian kings inscribed victories boasting of taking the tribute of the Phoenician coast. Even in their independence, the Phoenicians were never beyond the shadow of empires. But here again their geography made them clever. With no room to build great armies, they honed the art of diplomacy. They paid tribute when necessary, traded when possible, and navigated carefully between powers that sought to dominate them. The mountains stood behind them as a protective wall, making full-scale conquest difficult. The land between mountains and sea created a people who were neither conquerors nor farmers, but sailors. Every cedar beam that left Lebanon carried with it a fragment of their future. Every ship that slid into the water extended their reach further west. From the limitations of their land, they carved the foundation of an empire not of territory, but of trade and influence. Theirs was not an empire of soil and stone, but of wind and wave. And from this precarious strip of coastline, they would set forth to connect the known world, binding Egypt to Mesopotamia, Cyprus to Spain, Africa to Europe. Their geography, harsh and narrow, made them eternal masters of the sea. The mountains behind them whispered of protection and danger. The sea before them promised riches and risk. In that narrow balance, the Phoenicians were born as sailors of destiny. And it was from these harbors, natural sanctuaries carved by the earth itself, that the first great city of their world, Byblos, would rise to become the oldest gateway of the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean world had many ports, but only a few could claim to be eternal. Among them stood Byblos, a city older than memory, older than empire, older even than many of the gods worshipped within its walls. To walk through Byblos in the ancient age was to step into the very rhythm of history itself. For here, on a rocky stretch of the Phoenician coast, the first great heartbeat of Phoenician identity pulsed. Archaeologists digging in Byblos have uncovered traces of settlement stretching back more than 7,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Long before it bore the Greek name Byblos, it was known to its people as Gubla or Gebal. In these earliest centuries, its story was tied not only to the sea before it, but to the great power of Egypt far to the south. Byblos' rise came from the cedar forests of Lebanon. Egypt, with its temples of stone and its colossal ambitions, hungered for timber, something its desert plains could not provide. Papyrus reeds grew thick along the Nile, but strong wood for building ships, roofing palaces, and crafting sarcophagi was rare. The pharaohs turned their eyes northward to the towering cedars that crowned the Lebanon mountains, and thus Byblos became their gateway. Ships from Byblos, their hulls crafted from cedar itself, carried immense logs down the coast and across the waters to Egypt. In return came treasures of the Nile, gold, linen, ivory, and above all papyrus. The exchange was so enduring, so defining, that the very Greek word Byblos, meaning papyrus, and by extension book, came to name the city. Through Byblos, the world gained not only wood and goods, but the means of writing itself. This commerce was not mere trade, it was the weaving of cultures. Egyptian gods found a second home in Byblos. The goddess Hathor, protector of sailors and foreign lands, became beloved here. Temples in Byblos bore the touch of Egyptian design, their stone blocks inscribed with hieroglyphs carried across the sea. In return, Phoenician craftsmen adorned Egyptian courts with carved ivory, jewelry, and woodwork, blending styles that carried whispers of two civilizations. One story illustrates the intimacy between Egypt and Byblos, the tale of Osiris and Isis. According to later retellings, when the body of Osiris was scattered across the world, one part, his coffin, drifted to the shores of Byblos. There it became enclosed within a great cedar tree, which was cut down to form a pillar in the palace of the king of Byblos. The goddess Isis, in her search, traveled to Byblos to recover her husband's remains. In this myth, Byblos was not just a port of trade, but a sacred place where the divine touched earth. The story echoed the city's role, a bridge between worlds, where gods and merchants alike crossed paths. Life within Byblos mirrored its dual nature as both ancient settlement and bustling port. Its streets, narrow and winding, were filled with the scent of cedar resin and salt air. Merchants from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia brushed shoulders in its markets. Artisans displayed carved wood, glass trinkets, and dyed textiles. Scribes, using imported papyrus, copied contracts, prayers, and records that traveled across the sea. Byblos thrived not on conquest, but on connection. Religion anchored its civic pride. At the heart of Byblos stood the temple of Balat Gebel, the Lady of Byblos, a goddess who embodied the city itself. She was a mother and protector, and her temple drew pilgrims and offerings from afar. Egyptian pharaohs left inscriptions there, dedicating gifts to her favor, acknowledging her power over the gateway they so relied upon. Here was a city where trade and faith merged, where gods and goods were entwined. The kings of Byblos, too, knew their role as mediators between mountains, sea, and empire. Their inscriptions speak of diplomacy, of sending tribute to Egypt, of balancing autonomy with dependence. They were not warlords commanding vast armies, but stewards of a city whose strength lay in ships and cedar. Their legacy is preserved in stone sarcophagi, carved with hieroglyphic prayers, blending Egyptian reverence with Phoenician pride. Byblos's age gave it authority. While other Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, later Carthage, but would rise in their turn, Byblos always carried the aura of origin. It was the city from which cedar first sailed south, the city whose name became tied to the written word, the city whose myths wove it into Egypt's sacred stories. Even the Greeks, centuries later, looked back and saw Byblos as a place where knowledge and writing began. And yet for all its grandeur, Byblos was never isolated. Its prosperity depended on fragile balance. To the east loomed Mesopotamian empires, to the south the pharaohs, to the north Anatolian powers. Any one of them could demand submission, tribute, or control. Byblos survived not by resisting, but by embracing its role as indispensable. Egypt needed its cedar. Mesopotamia needed its ships. Everyone needed its harbor. So long as those needs endured, Byblos endured too. The rhythm of the city was set by the sea. Each dawn, sails rose on the horizon. Each dusk, the harbor filled with vessels heavy with goods. The creak of cedar beams, the chants of sailors, the calls of merchants. These were the heartbeat of Byblos. The mountains gave them timber, but the sea gave them purpose. Over time, Byblos would be overshadowed by Tyre's might and Carthage's empire. But it never vanished. Even as centuries passed, the world remembered Byblos as the oldest gateway, the city where civilization itself seemed to breathe. Its stones, its cedar, its myths, all whispered of beginnings. Byblos opened the first great gate of Phoenician destiny, binding Egypt and the Levant through cedar and papyrus. Yet south along the coast another city was stirring, Sidon, whose artisans would discover a secret so rare and costly that it would crown kings and cloak emperors, the making of purple. On the Phoenician coast, South of Byblos but north of Tyre, stood a city whose name shimmered with craft, colour and renown, Sidon. To the ancient world, Sidon was not merely a port, but a workshop of wonders. Its harbours opened onto the Mediterranean like welcoming arms, and from its streets flowed treasures that would define status, wealth and even divinity itself. Among the Phoenician cities, Sidon was old, rivaling Byblos in antiquity. In Egyptian inscriptions, it appeared as early as the 2nd millennium BCE, its name etched in hieroglyphs as a place of cedar, ships and tribute. But in time, Sidon came to be known less for its timber than for its artisanship. Its craftsmen mastered the art of shaping, colouring and transforming materials in ways that seemed nearly magical. The most celebrated of all was the making of purple dye. To later ages, it would be called Tyrian purple, named for Sidon's sister city Tyre. Yet the first workshops, the first discoveries, belonged to Sidon. Here along the rocky coast, fishermen gathered baskets of murex shells, small spiny sea snails clinging to the stones and reefs. In their flesh lay a secret, a gland that, when carefully extracted and treated, yielded a liquid that, after exposure to air and sunlight, transformed into a deep, radiant purple. The process was brutal in its scale. Tens of thousands of shells were needed to produce even a small quantity of dye. The stench of the workshops clung to the harbours, the reek of rotting shells spreading across the shore. Yet from this foul labour came one of the most precious substances of the ancient world. The purple of Sidon was unlike any other colour. It did not fade, but grew richer with age. It shimmered in the light, carrying hints of crimson and violet. It was said to echo the very hues of twilight over the sea. Because of its rarity and cost, purple became the colour of kings. In Mesopotamia, priests and rulers wore it to signify power. In Egypt, pharaohs wrapped themselves in garments dyed with Sidon's treasure. In Greece and Rome, centuries later, purple robes would mark emperors, senators and generals. To wear Sidonian purple was to proclaim authority, wealth and divinity. But Sidon's brilliance extended beyond dye. Its artisans shaped glass in forms unknown elsewhere. By heating sand and mixing it with natron, they created vessels that captured light itself. Clear, coloured or patterned, Sidonian glassware travelled across the Mediterranean, prized in palaces from Egypt to Assyria. Some claimed the very invention of glassblowing, a technique that would transform the craft, began on these shores. Whether invention or refinement, Sidon's glass became synonymous with beauty. The city thrived on this reputation. Merchants crowded its markets, bartering purple cloth, glass vessels, cedar, ivory and silver. Ships from Sidon reached Cyprus, Anatolia, and beyond, laden with goods. The wealth they brought filled the city with temples, palaces, and monuments to its gods. Among them was Eshmun, the healer, whose sanctuary near Sidon became a place of pilgrimage. Here water flowed from sacred springs, and offerings were left for health and renewal. Religion, craft, and commerce blended in Sidonian life, each reinforcing the other. Yet prosperity was never free of peril. The very fame that purple dye brought also attracted envy and conquest. Egyptians sought Sidon's tribute. Assyrian kings carved into stone their triumphs over Sidon's rulers. Later, Babylonian armies besieged its walls. Sidon endured through diplomacy, resistance, and submission, sometimes flourishing under empire, sometimes suffering under its yoke. The city's artisans never ceased their work, for conquerors too desired its treasures. Purple robes clothed the very kings who demanded Sidon's surrender. The people of Sidon carried pride in their craft. Ancient writers often called all Phoenicians Sidonians, so closely was the name linked with their collective identity. To foreigners, Sidon embodied Phoenicia itself, a people of ships, dye, and glass. To wear Sidonian purple was not only to wear wealth, but to carry a fragment of the city's soul. The harbour of Sidon told this story daily. Sailors hauled in baskets of shells, their hands stained and raw. Artisans toiled in smoke-filled workshops, their glass glowing red in the furnace before cooling into shimmering forms. Traders haggled, weighing cloth dyed in hues so rare they seemed divine. Priests offered sacrifices at temples, seeking the favour of Baal and Astarte for calm seas and prosperous voyages. Life here was a symphony of labor and devotion, color and commerce. In myths, even the gods of Greece were said to have walked Sidon's shores. Legends told of Europa, the daughter of a Sidonian king, whom Zeus carried away across the sea in the form of a bull. In her name, the very continent of Europe was christened. Another tale spoke of Cadmus, her brother, who left Sidon to search for her and went on to found Thebes in Greece. These myths, though told by others, reflected Sidon's deep impression on the imagination of the Mediterranean. Sidon's greatness, however, was not eternal. Over centuries it was rivaled and often overshadowed by Tyre, whose island fortress proved more defensible. Yet even in Tyre's dominance, Sidon never faded into obscurity. Its craftsmen, its dye, its glass, all remained renowned. When empires came and went, when conquerors marched and fleets clashed, the purple of Sidon continued to adorn kings. The glass of Sidon continued to capture light, and the name of Sidon continued to echo across the sea. To stand in Sidon in its prime was to witness transformation, the transformation of shell into color, sand into glass, labor into wealth, obscurity into renown. From its workshops came not only treasures, but identity, for Sidon was the maker of purple, the crafter of beauty, the city where artisans shaped the very symbols of power. The dyes of Sidon gave kings their robes, and its glass gave palaces their brilliance. Yet further south, on an island fortress that seemed untouchable, another city rose higher still, Tyre, the defiant stronghold of the sea, whose walls and harbors would test the ambitions of empires. The Mediterranean sun gleamed upon waters that curled gently around a city like no other. Tyre, the pride of Phoenicia, stood half upon the coast, half upon a rocky island 1 kilometer offshore. That island, crowned with towering walls of white stone, shimmered like a fortress risen from the sea itself. Mariners called it unconquerable, and kings who dreamt of its riches often abandoned those dreams upon seeing the task before them. Tyre's genius lay in geography. 2 harbors, north and south, embraced the sea like outstretched arms. They welcomed fleets of traders, Egyptian ships heavy with grain and papyrus, Cypriot vessels stacked with copper, Aegean traders offering pottery and olive oil. From Tyre's own shores came purple dye so rare it was worth more than gold, fine glass shaped by Sidonian craftsmen, and cedar timber floated down from the mountains of Lebanon. With each tide, wealth and influence swelled the city's coffers. But Tyre was more than a trading post. It was a fortress of will. For centuries, great empires looked upon it with hunger. The Assyrians came first, their armies famed for cruelty and iron discipline. They besieged the city, battering the mainland quarter into submission. But the island, surrounded by waves, defended by Phoenician fleets, stood defiant. The Assyrian kings collected tribute, yes, but they never truly broke Tyre. The Babylonians came next. Nebuchadnezzar III, master of Mesopotamia, laid siege to the island city for 13 relentless years. His soldiers built towers, battering rams, and engines of war, but the sea protected Tyre as faithfully as any army. When the siege finally ended, Babylon claimed a hollow victory. Tyre's independence endured, its island walls untouched, its merchants still sailing freely. The legend of its invincibility grew. For generations, Tyre balanced diplomacy and defiance. It paid tribute when it had to, swore loyalty to powerful overlords, but kept its autonomy on the waters. The city was like a pearl in a shell, difficult to grasp, impossible to crush. Its gods, Melkart above all, were worshipped with lavish rituals, their temples filled with offerings from across the Mediterranean. And its sailors ventured far, to Cyprus, to Sicily, even to the distant coasts of Spain. Everywhere they went, the name of Tyre commanded respect. But destiny had set its gaze upon Tyre. In 332 BCE, a conqueror unlike any before appeared upon its shores, Alexander of Macedon. He had swept through Anatolia, shattered the Persian armies, and now turned south to secure the Phoenician coast. Most cities surrendered without struggle. Sidon opened its gates, Byblos welcomed him, but Tyre, proud and unyielding, chose defiance. The Tyrians sent envoys, declaring they would remain neutral. Alexander could offer sacrifices to their gods, they said, but only from the mainland. The island sanctuary of Melkart would remain closed. To the Tyrians, It was a matter of sovereignty. To Alexander, it was defiance he could not endure. What followed was one of the most extraordinary sieges in history. Alexander ordered a causeway built across the sea, a massive land bridge of stone, timber, and earth, stretching from the mainland to the island. Each day his men hauled boulders into the waves, sinking them into the seabed. Slowly, painfully, the sea began to give way. The Tyrians watched in fury and disbelief. They launched fireships against the causeway, burning siege towers to ash. Divers cut the moorings of Alexander's defences. Archers upon the island walls rained arrows upon the labourers below, but Alexander would not be denied. He summoned fleets from conquered Phoenician cities, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, turning Tyre's own kin against it. The battle became a test of wills, island against empire, pride against ambition. For 7 months it dragged on, the causeway inching forward despite storms and fire. At last, in July of 332 BCE, the Macedonians breached the walls. They stormed into Tyre with ruthless fury. Thousands were slain, thousands more sold into slavery. The proud fortress of the sea had fallen, yet even in defeat, Tyre left its mark. Alexander himself, awed by the city's resilience, sacrificed in the temple of Melkart, honoring the god of his enemies. The causeway he built forever changed the geography. The island of Tyre was now joined to the mainland, a peninsula where once waves had ruled, and the legend of Tyre, though scarred, endured. For centuries after, Tyre remained a vital city, rebuilt and reborn under Greek and Roman rule. Its merchants still sailed the seas, its purple dye still coloured the robes of emperors, but its days of independence were gone. The fortress that once defied empires had been folded into the empires themselves, and yet, when one stands upon its shores, gazing at the narrow strip of land that binds it to the coast, echoes of that defiant spirit linger. Tyre was more than stone walls and harbours. It was a testament to the power of resilience, the audacity of ambition, and the eternal dance between sea and shore. But Tyre was not the end of the Phoenician story. As its harbours bustled under foreign rule, other Phoenician cities and colonies carried the legacy forward. Across the western seas, a new power was rising, one that would inherit Tyre's mantle and challenge the mightiest empire of all. Its name was Carthage. The sea was their kingdom. While others built empires with walls of stone and legions of soldiers, the Phoenicians stitched together their dominion across waves of blue, their sails billowing like banners of sovereignty. In an age when the Mediterranean was more a barrier than a bridge, they transformed it into a highway of opportunity. From their narrow strip of homeland along the Levantine coast, the Phoenicians gazed westward, their eyes drawn to horizons where the sun dipped into the sea. They had little farmland, few natural defences, and no sprawling hinterland to protect them. But they had cedar forests, shipbuilding genius, and a hunger for survival that turned them outward. The mountains pressed them from behind. The sea beckoned them forward. Their first steps into the wider Mediterranean began with Cyprus. The island, rich in copper, lay close enough to reach yet far enough to test their seamanship. By mastering that route, they learned to trust the sea as a partner, not an enemy. Soon their trade routes extended farther, connecting Egypt's wealth, Anatolia's metals, and Mesopotamia's luxuries. Step by step, island by island, coast by coast, they carved a network invisible, yet indelible. By the 9th century BCE, their ships, sleek, sturdy, and swift, were a common sight from the Levant to the Pillars of Hercules. They carried cedar beams prized for palaces and temples, delicate glassware that shimmered like captured sunlight, and above all, the dye that turned cloth into emblems of power, Tyrian purple. But the Phoenicians traded more than goods. Every port was a meeting point, every cargo a vessel of ideas. Their alphabet, simple and adaptable, traveled as quietly as their ships, changing the course of human communication. The Phoenicians were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They left behind no vast land empire, no towering walls comparable to Babylon or Nineveh. Instead, they mastered a subtler art. They founded colonies. These were not imposed settlements, but seeds carefully planted along the edges of the Mediterranean. Some were modest trading stations, little more than warehouses and docks. Others, like Gades, Modern Cadiz in Spain grew into thriving cities that endured long after Phoenicia's homeland had faded into the shadows of stronger empires. Among their colonies, none shone brighter than Carthage. Established in the 9th century BCE by settlers from Tyre, it soon grew beyond its parent city. With its strategic position on the North African coast, Carthage controlled trade between east and west, north and south. It became the heir to Phoenician ambition, carrying their maritime genius into a new age. Yet Carthage was only one part of a larger mosaic. Across the Mediterranean, Phoenician outposts dotted the map like stepping stones. Malta, Sardinia, Sicily, each became part of their web. Even on the distant Atlantic shores of Spain, they founded settlements to tap into the trade of silver and tin. These metals, rare and precious, were the lifeblood of ancient economies, and the Phoenicians were their most trusted carriers. What made the Phoenicians unique was their adaptability. They did not seek to dominate the peoples they encountered. Instead, they blended. In Egypt, they adopted art styles. In Greece, they shared myths. In the West, they integrated with local tribes. Their presence was felt not as an iron hand, but as a quiet tide, reshaping coastlines without erasing them. Their ships were their true empire. The galleys they built could carry heavy cargo while remaining nimble enough for coastal navigation. The Phoenicians pioneered the use of the birim, a vessel with 2 banks of oars that gave them speed and maneuverability. Their sailors navigated by the stars, a skill so refined that the Greeks later called the North Star the Phoenician Star. Long before others dared, they ventured into the open sea at night, trusting the heavens to guide them home. And so they earned their title, the Masters of the Mediterranean. Kings and emperors relied on them. When the Assyrian rulers demanded tribute, it often came in the form of Phoenician ships and sailors. When Egypt sought cedar for its temples and obelisks, it turned to Phoenician merchants. Even distant cultures felt their touch. Amber from the Baltic reached the Levant through Phoenician hands. Ivory from Africa, spices from Arabia, and metals from Europe all converged in their harbors. But mastery of the sea came with risks. To control so many routes meant exposing themselves to pirates, storms, and rival traders. A single lost ship could mean months of effort washed away. Yet time and again they endured. Their resilience lay not in brute force but in their networks. If one route faltered, another thrived. If one colony weakened, another grew stronger. Perhaps their greatest achievement was invisibility. Unlike empires that shouted their power with monuments and armies, the Phoenicians left behind whispers. They did not carve their triumphs in stone, they wove them into the fabric of trade. Their influence spread so widely, so subtly, that even when their homeland was conquered, first by the Assyrians, then Babylonians, Persians, and finally Alexander, their legacy remained afloat. Their mastery was not eternal, but it was transformative. By the time others rose to prominence, Greece, Rome, Carthage itself, the patterns the Phoenicians had drawn across the sea were already permanent. They had shown that the Mediterranean could be more than a boundary. It could be a bridge. For centuries they had ruled with sails instead of swords, with trade instead of tyranny, and even as their name faded, their impact endured in every alphabet written, every ship launched, every colony founded on distant shores. The Phoenicians were no longer just a people. They had become the silent architects of Mediterranean civilization. But what if their greatest legacy was not the ships that cut across the sea, nor the colonies that dotted the coasts, but something even more profound? A gift of language itself, a code of symbols that reshaped human thought. In the next chapter, we turn to the alphabet that changed the world. It began as so many revolutions do, in silence. No grand armies marched, no palaces toppled, no temples burned. Instead, in the quiet strokes of ink on papyrus, in the carving of symbols upon clay or wood, humanity was given a tool so transformative that it outlived empires, gods, and cities. The Phoenicians, masters of the sea, had given the world more than purple dye, glass, or cedar. They had given it the gift of letters. Before their time, writing was the realm of specialists. In Mesopotamia, scribes bent over clay tablets, impressing the intricate wedges of cuneiform. In Egypt, priests and officials painted hieroglyphs upon walls and papyrus, each image a blend of art and language. These systems were rich, beautiful, and powerful, but they were also complex. To master them took years of training. Ordinary merchants, sailors, or farmers had little hope of recording their own thoughts. The Phoenicians, living between great empires yet always in their shadow, found another way. As traders, they needed efficiency, a script that could travel as easily as their ships. From the tangled roots of earlier scripts, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Proto-Canaanite markings, and local adaptations, they pruned away excess. What emerged was not a forest of thousands of symbols, but a small grove, 22 characters, each representing a sound. It was genius in its simplicity. Each symbol, abstract and streamlined, stood for a consonant. Vowels, so natural to the human voice, were left to context. To read was to hear the word in one's mind, filling in the missing sounds. For the first time, writing mirrored speech closely enough that almost anyone could learn it. This alphabet did not demand years of priestly education. A trader could master it in weeks. A sailor could scrawl it on wood or stone. A child could scratch it into wax. The script was portable, adaptable, and alive. As the Phoenicians spread across the Mediterranean, so too did their letters. On shards of pottery left in Cyprus, on inscriptions carved in Sardinia, on tablets unearthed in Spain, traces of the Phoenician script whisper of its travels. The Greeks encountered it first. To them, the Phoenician letters were like seeds waiting to sprout. They borrowed, reshaped, and added vowels, creating a new system that more closely captured their speech. From Alpha to Omega, the Greek alphabet was born, and from Greece, it traveled further still. The Romans inherited it, carving it into marble and inscribing it upon laws. Their version, the Latin alphabet, became the backbone of Europe's written culture. Today, it lives on in the words you read at this very moment, but the influence did not stop there. The Hebrew and Aramaic alphabets grew from Phoenician roots. From Aramaic, in turn, sprang scripts that gave birth to Arabic, Persian, and even those of South Asia. In an almost invisible chain of inheritance, the Phoenicians had reshaped the very way humanity communicated. Imagine the scene. A Phoenician merchant arrives at a foreign port, cedar logs stacked in his ship, jars of purple dye packed below deck. As he bargains with a local trader, he scratches notes into a wax tablet, recording amounts, weights, and promises. He does not need a scribe or a priest. The letters are his own. For the first time in history, the common man could wield the power of writing. It is hard to overstate what this meant. Writing no longer belonged to the few. It could belong to the many. It democratized knowledge, laying the groundwork for literacy to spread far beyond palace walls. When alphabets took root, they changed memory itself. Oral traditions could now be recorded, preserved against the erosion of time. Laws could be codified, contracts enforced, stories written and shared across generations. And yet, the Phoenicians themselves left behind so little. Irony clings to their legacy. The very people who gave writing to the world preserved few records of their own. We know them largely through the voices of others, Egyptian, Greek, Roman. Their own words scratched into stone or etched into fragile materials are scarce. Perhaps they were too busy sailing, too preoccupied with trade, too transient to build great libraries. Or perhaps their legacy was never meant to be kept at home, but carried outward, like the cargo of their ships. Their alphabet was practical, not ornamental. It was not designed for poetry or grandeur, but for speed and clarity. And in that practicality lay its genius. It could be bent, borrowed, and reshaped by any culture that touched it. Each people who adopted it made it their own. The Greeks gave it elegance. The Romans gave it endurance. The Hebrews gave it sacred weight. The Phoenicians gave it life. Some scholars argue that no invention in human history, not the wheel, not bronze, not even gunpowder, has had the lasting influence of the alphabet. For without it, laws cannot endure, science cannot advance, and literature cannot flourish. The alphabet is civilization's skeleton, invisible but essential. And it was born not in the courts of kings, but in the hands of merchants on the shores of the Levant. To think of this gift is to marvel at the paradox of the Phoenicians, a people so often forgotten, their name fading into the margins of history, yet their invention living on in every book, every law, every letter, sent across the centuries. They were masters of the sea, but also masters of something greater, the sea of human thought. As their ships traced the outlines of the known world, their letters traced the outlines of human memory. Even when their cities fell, when their independence was crushed by empires, when their colonies became powers of their own, the alphabet endured. Carthage would burn, Tyre would crumble, Sidon would bow to conquerors, but the letters remained. The alphabet was not stone or bronze. It did not need armies to defend it. It was lighter than air, carried in the minds of men and women, etched into whatever surface lay at hand. It spread quietly, inevitably, like ripples on water. And so, from the narrow strip of Phoenician land between mountain and sea, a revolution unfolded. A revolution not of blood, but of ink, not of conquest, but of connection. Yet even as their letters conquered the world, the Phoenicians themselves carried their culture further westward, planting a new city on the African shore, a city destined to rise above its parent and challenge the might of Rome itself. In the next chapter, we sail to Carthage, heir of Tyre. The sun dipped low across the African horizon as sails appeared on the sea, catching the last golden rays. They belonged to Phoenician ships, cedar-strong and salt-worn, carrying families, traders, and wanderers. They had left Tyre behind, seeking refuge, opportunity, and perhaps destiny. What they found on the shores of North Africa was more than a harbour. It was the beginning of Carthage, the city that would one day rival Rome itself. Legend tells us of Queen Dido, or Elissa, as the Phoenicians knew her. Fleeing from her brother's treachery in Tyre, she carried with her not just loyal followers, but also the memory of her homeland. The story is embroidered with myth, how she bargained with the local king for as much land as could be encircled by an ox hide, then cut the hide into strips so thin that it stretched around an entire hill. Upon that hill, Immerse, Carthage, was born. Whether the tale is truth or legend, it carries within it the sharp wit and practical cunning that defined the city's spirit. Carthage rose swiftly. Its location was perfect, a natural harbour, fertile hinterlands, and access to vital trade routes. From here, Phoenician ships reached westward to Spain and beyond, southward into Africa, and northward across the Mediterranean. Cedar, silver, ivory, slaves, and grain flowed through its markets. Carthage became the beating heart of Phoenician expansion. But Carthage was not merely a colony. It became an empire in its own right, surpassing even Tyre and Sidon. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage commanded a maritime network stretching from North Africa to Sardinia, from Sicily to the Pillars of Hercules. Its ships were everywhere. Its merchants negotiated with kings, its admirals patrolled the seas, its diplomats secured alliances and influence. At home, Carthage was a city of contrasts. Its temples rose high, dedicated to Baal Hammon and Tanit, the gods who watched over fertility and fire. Its markets overflowed with goods from 3 continents. Its streets bustled with farmers, sailors, artisans, and slaves. Wealthy aristocrats controlled estates, while powerful merchants sat in the council that ruled the city. Unlike monarchies of the East, Carthage developed a system closer to a republic, guided by a senate of elders and elected officials known as suffetes. To later Greeks and Romans, Carthage seemed both strange and familiar, a mirror and a rival. Yet shadows haunted the city. Tales of child sacrifice have long clung to its name. Rituals to appease Baal Hammon, where infants were said to be offered in fire. Archaeological remains of burial urns, filled with the bones of children, have fueled this grim reputation. Some argue these were simply cemeteries for stillborn infants. Others insist they were signs of ritual slaughter. Whatever the truth, the stories spread, darkening Carthage's image in the eyes of its enemies. Still, the city thrived. Its navy was the envy of the ancient world, fast and disciplined. Its sailors hardened by endless voyages. Its armies, though often composed of mercenaries, were fierce under Carthaginian command. And its wealth bought loyalty, alliances, and power. But with power came rivalry. Carthage's expansion into Sicily brought it into direct conflict with the rising city-state of Rome. The two powers, born of different worlds, yet destined for collision, eyed each other across the waters. For now, though, Carthage basked in its greatness. Picture the city at its height, white walls gleaming under the African sun, harbors alive with ships unloading their treasures, the smell of spices, salt, and cedar heavy in the air. In the council chambers, debates raged over trade policies and military campaigns. In the temples, priests lit fires to their gods. In the markets, merchants bargained, slaves were bought and sold, and gold changed hands in glittering heaps. Carthage was alive, restless, ambitious. It was more than a city. It was a dream of empire, carried on the winds of the Mediterranean. And yet, its destiny was tied to struggle. The same sea that had given it wealth would one day bring warships to its shores. The same brilliance that made it powerful would attract enemies who sought its destruction. For now, though, Carthage stood triumphant, heir of Tyre, jewel of the Western Sea, a city whose star was still rising. But greatness invites rivalry. Beyond the waves in the Italian peninsula, another power was stirring, disciplined, relentless, and hungry. Soon the Mediterranean would not be large enough for both. The stage was set for one of the most legendary conflicts in history, the struggle between Carthage and Rome. In the quiet of dawn, as waves lapped against rocky harbors, smoke rose from Phoenician altars. The air filled with the scent of burning incense, mingled with salt and cedar. For the Phoenicians, the sea was both a blessing and a danger, and the gods who ruled over it had to be honored. Their faith was not confined to temples alone. It lived in the winds, the forests, and the restless waters that carried their ships into the unknown. The Phoenician pantheon was vast, but at its heart stood powerful deities. Baal-Hamon, the god of storms and fertility, lord of fire and the harvest. Astarte, goddess of love and war, radiant and unpredictable. Melkart, the heroic protector of Tyre, a god of renewal and the cycle of life and death. And in Carthage, Tanit, a goddess who embodied motherhood, fertility, and the eternal feminine. Each city had its own divine patron. In Byblos, Astarte was worshipped with sacred rites, linking the people to the fertility of the land. In Tyre, Melkart's temple stood high, its fires burning as sailors departed on long voyages, praying for safe return. Sidon, ever a place of artisans, dedicated shrines to Baal, hoping for prosperity in trade and protection on dangerous waters. Ritual was woven into daily life. Farmers poured libations of wine into the soil before planting, asking the gods for abundant harvests. Sailors cast offerings into the sea, praying that storms would spare their vessels. Merchants sacrificed doves, oxen, or sheep before entering into new ventures, hoping that Baal would bless their journeys. The gods were present at every turn, their favor sought in small intimate gestures as well as in grand ceremonies. Temples rose as centers of both worship and community. They were not only places of prayer, but also treasuries, archives, and symbols of civic pride. Their courtyards echoed with chants, drums, and the lowing of animals brought for sacrifice. Fires blazed on altars, carrying the scent of burnt offerings upward, as priests intoned prayers that blended the old traditions of Canaan with the seafaring spirit of the Phoenicians. But it is the darker whispers of Phoenician religion that have fascinated and horrified later generations. Roman and Greek writers spoke of child sacrifice, of infants placed upon the flames in honor of Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Archaeological discoveries at Carthage revealed burial urns, known as tuffets, containing the charred remains of children and animals alike. Were these signs of ritual sacrifice, or were they cemeteries for those who died young, sanctified by offering them to the gods? The debate endures, casting a shadow over the Phoenician legacy. Whatever the truth, religion bound the Phoenicians together. Their myths told of creation, of chaos tamed by divine order, of gods who rose and fell like the waves. Their rites connected the living to the eternal, and their symbols, crescent moons, stars, and sacred trees, decorated amulets carried across the seas. Through faith, they sought to make sense of a world that was vast, perilous, and often beyond their control. The influence of Phoenician religion spread far beyond their own shores. Greek myths absorbed echoes of Astarte in the form of Aphrodite and Hera. Melkart's cycle of death and rebirth mirrored the tales of Heracles. Even Rome, centuries later, would adopt Tanit under a different name, weaving her into its tapestry of gods. In this way, Phoenician faith lived on, reshaped and retold by others, surviving even as their own voices faded. Imagine then the night rituals in Carthage. Torches flickered in the dark, drums beat a steady rhythm, priests chanted ancient words. Families stood in silence, their faces lit by the fire, their hearts heavy with fear or hope. Whether offering grain, animals, or perhaps something more, they believed they were part of a sacred exchange, their devotion for the gods' protection, their sacrifice for survival. Religion was not abstract for them. It was survival. It was the difference between safe passage or shipwreck, harvest or famine, victory or defeat. It was woven into the marrow of their lives, shaping the choices they made, the cities they built, the way they saw the world. And yet, faith was also fragile. Empires would come and go, gods would be renamed or forgotten, rituals abandoned or transformed. But for centuries, the Phoenicians carried their gods with them across the Mediterranean, carving their symbols into stones, whispering their prayers into the wind, and leaving traces that still linger in the myths we know today. But while their gods gave them strength, their ships gave them power. Beyond temples and altars, the Phoenicians faced an ever-changing political world, empires rising and falling, each seeking to control them. To survive, they needed more than faith. They needed cunning, diplomacy, and the resilience of a people who lived between land and sea. The Levantine coast, where the Phoenicians carved their harbors, was a narrow strip of land coveted by empires. To the south lay Egypt, ancient and ambitious. From the east came the Assyrians, fierce and relentless. Later arrived the Babylonians with their glittering capitals, and beyond them the Persians, masters of a vast and ordered realm. For the Phoenicians, whose strength lay in ships rather than soldiers, survival depended not on conquest but on accommodation. They were traders, not warriors, merchants rather than kings. Their power flowed not from armies but from cedar forests, harbors, and the endless sea. Egypt was among the first to recognize their value. Byblos, with its cedar trade, had bound itself to the pharaohs as early as the Old Kingdom. Egyptian tombs depict Phoenician ships laden with wood, wine, and luxury goods. To the Egyptians, the Phoenicians were essential partners, supplying the timber that raised temples and built ships along the Nile. Tribute was offered, gifts were exchanged, and for centuries relations remained a dance of mutual benefit. But when the Assyrians surged westward in the first millennium BCE, the tone changed. The Assyrians demanded submission, tribute in gold, silver, and goods, and obedience to their rule. Cities like Tyre and Sidon were besieged when they resisted, their walls battered, their citizens humbled. Yet the Phoenicians, clever and resourceful, often negotiated their way back into favor. Their ships were too valuable, their knowledge of the sea too rare for the Assyrians to simply destroy. Babylon followed, inheriting Assyria's mantle. Nebuchadnezzar the coup, who rebuilt Babylon into a wonder of the world, turned his gaze toward Tyre. For 13 years, he besieged the city, but Tyre endured. The island fortress resisted his armies, and though eventually brought to terms, it never fell in flames. The Phoenicians proved again that their survival was not measured in outright victories, but in endurance, in yielding without breaking. Then came the Persians. Under Cyrus the Great and his successors, Phoenician cities were drawn into the vast Achaemenid Empire. But here their fortunes flourished. The Persians valued their seafaring above all else. Phoenician fleets became the backbone of Persian naval power, carrying troops across the Mediterranean, enforcing imperial rule, and extending Persia's reach into new territories. For this service, Phoenician cities were granted autonomy, their traditions respected, their trade routes protected. In this dance with empires, the Phoenicians revealed their genius. They did not resist the tide of history, but rode upon it. Where armies marched, they offered tribute. Where conquerors demanded, they negotiated. Where rulers needed ships, they provided them, turning necessity into advantage. Their resilience lay in adaptability. Unlike the Greeks who fought for independence or the Hebrews who resisted conquest, the Phoenicians bent without breaking. Their cities were sacked, their rulers humbled, but their harbors endured, their ships sailed on, and their trade continued. It was a fragile balance. Each empire that rose brought new dangers. Tribute was costly, and sieges could devastate. Yet again and again, the Phoenicians survived, their identity intact, their role as the Mediterranean's lifeline secure. To walk the streets of Tyre or Sidon in those days was to feel the pulse of many worlds. Assyrian officials collected tribute, Persian envoys inspected fleets, Babylonian merchants bartered in the markets, and Egyptian goods filled the stalls. The Phoenicians lived not in isolation, but in the heart of empire, always adjusting, always enduring. And yet beneath their pragmatism lay pride. They were not simply subjects of empires, they were the masters of the sea, the ones who carried the goods that kings desired, the ones who connected lands and cultures. Their strength was subtle, quiet, but immense. It is here that the true genius of the Phoenicians emerges. They understood that survival was not always about defiance. Sometimes it was about endurance. Sometimes it was about bending like the cedar in the storm, only to rise tall again when the winds had passed. But even as they thrived under empire, their fate was not entirely their own. Across the sea, a new rival was rising, one born of Phoenician settlers themselves. Carthage, the daughter of Tyre, would carry their legacy into a new world, and in doing so would challenge the greatest power Rome had ever known. By the 3rd century BCE, the balance of the Mediterranean was shifting. On the coast of North Africa, Carthage, a proud daughter of Tyre, had grown from a Phoenician colony into a mighty empire of its own. Across the sea in Italy, Rome had risen from a small city-state to a formidable republic, its legions disciplined, its ambition boundless. Inevitably, their paths collided. The wars that followed, known as the Punic Wars, would last more than a century, fought across land and sea, and would decide who would rule the Mediterranean. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE, sparked by disputes over Sicily, that fertile island lying between Carthage and Rome. Carthage, master of the sea, seemed unassailable at first, but Rome, though inexperienced at naval warfare, built fleets of its own. They invented the corvus, a boarding device that turned sea battles into infantry fights, where Roman discipline triumphed. After more than 20 years of bitter conflict, Rome emerged victorious. Carthage surrendered Sicily, the first great loss in its history. Yet Carthage recovered. Its leaders turned their energy toward Spain, building new wealth and armies from silver mines and Iberian recruits. From this strength rose Hannibal Barca, a general whose name would echo through history. In 218 BCE, during the Second Punic War, Hannibal launched one of the most daring campaigns ever attempted. He led an army from Spain across the Pyrenees, through Gaul and over the towering Alps, in winter. His soldiers marched through snow and ice, harassed by hostile tribes, while elephants, brought as symbols of power, struggled through mountain passes. Against all odds, Hannibal descended into Italy with a surviving army, ready to strike at the heart of Rome. What followed were years of terror for the Roman Republic. At battles like Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most famously Cannae, Hannibal crushed Roman armies, outmaneuvering and surrounding forces many times larger than his own. At Cannae in 216 BCE, nearly 50,000 Romans fell in a single day, their defeat etched into Rome's memory as one of its darkest hours. Yet Rome did not break. Refusing to surrender, it waged a war of endurance, avoiding pitched battles and slowly cutting Carthage's supply lines. Eventually, a Roman general, Scipio Africanus, carried the war back to Africa. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Hannibal faced Scipio. For the first time, Hannibal's tactics failed and Carthage was defeated. The Second Punic War ended with Rome, the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage, though weakened, was not yet destroyed. For 50 years it lived under Roman restrictions, stripped of power, but still alive. But Rome could not forget its old enemy. Politicians like Cato the Elder ended every speech with the words, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. The final blow came in the Third Punic War, 149–146 BCE. Rome laid siege to Carthage, surrounding the city by land and sea. For 3 years the Carthaginians resisted, fighting with desperation, defending their homes street by street. But in 146 BCE, the Romans broke through. Carthage was burned, its walls torn down, its people killed or enslaved. Legends later claimed the Romans sowed salt into its soil so nothing would grow again. With Carthage gone, the last great Phoenician power was extinguished. Rome stood supreme, and the legacy of centuries of Phoenician enterprise and seafaring fell into silence. And yet, even in defeat, the Phoenicians shaped their conquerors. Rome absorbed their gods, their trade routes, their techniques in navigation and commerce. The Punic language lingered in North Africa for centuries. Hannibal's genius became a lesson studied by Roman generals for generations. The spirit of Carthage, though crushed in fire, lived on in memory. But Carthage's fall was not the end of the Phoenician story. Across the Mediterranean, from ruined harbors to forgotten colonies, their influence endured. Their alphabets, their ships, their myths remained, even as their name faded. And so we come to the final reflection. How could a people who shaped the ancient world so profoundly be nearly erased from history? Along the Levantine coast, the harbors of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos lie buried under centuries of silt and stone. Waves break upon ruins that once launched fleets across the Mediterranean, carrying cedar, glass, purple dye, and the alphabet itself. Yet the voices of the Phoenicians are silent. Unlike the Egyptians, they left no pyramids. Unlike the Greeks, no epics. Unlike the Romans, no histories carved into marble. What we know of them comes mostly from outsiders, from Herodotus, who marveled at their voyages, from Egyptian inscriptions praising their cedar, from Roman accounts that remembered their rivals in Carthage. Their story is refracted, glimpsed through the eyes of others, a mosaic missing its central pieces. And yet, fragments remain. In the soil of Carthage, urns whisper of rituals. In Cadiz, once guards, the memory of Phoenician settlers lingers. In alphabets, in words, in myths, retold under new names, their presence endures. Even when forgotten, they are everywhere. The irony is profound. A people who connected the world are themselves half erased from it. They carried gods and goods, stories and scripts across seas, and yet their own tale dissolved into the tide. Perhaps this is the fate of those who build bridges. Their value lies not in what they preserve for themselves, but in what they leave behind for others. Still, in the quiet rhythm of the sea, one can almost hear them. The creak of oars, the snap of sails, the chants of sailors guiding their ships into the unknown. Their courage lies not only in empire or war, but in the willingness to step onto uncharted waters, to trust the horizon, to believe that beyond danger lay discovery. The Phoenicians remind us that greatness does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, carried on the wind, etched in letters, preserved in myths. Their story is fragile, but it is also eternal, echoing in the alphabets we write, in the ships that still cross seas, in the unseen threads of history that bind us all together. And so, as we close this journey, we stand at the shore of their memory. The waves retreat, leaving traces on the sand and faint, fleeting but real. To remember the Phoenicians is to honor the forgotten mariners who shaped the world, and to ask ourselves, what legacies will we leave behind? If this story moved you, if the whispers of the Phoenicians stirred your imagination, then carry their memory forward. Share your thoughts, let your voice join the echoes of history, and keep the conversation alive. Like, comment, and subscribe, not just for more stories, but to become part of this journey through the forgotten corners of our past. Because history lives only as long as we remember it.